Catastrophe has been the unexpected engine of human progress. Our greatest leaps forward did not come from peaceful times, but from the ashes of total disaster. This video uncovers how 20 ancient calamities, from volcanic super eruptions to civilization-ending plagues, each triggered a revolutionary jump in technology, society, or thought. You will discover the hidden link between collapse and creativity, seeing history's worst moments as the brutal but necessary birth of our modern world. How did a volcanic winter 74,000 years ago forge the modern human mind? And why did the collapse of the Bronze Age give power to the common person? What does our own future hold if the next great disaster is already here? 74,000 years ago, the human story almost ended. A cataclysm of unimaginable scale erupted from the supervolcano at Toba in what is now Indonesia. It was not merely a large explosion, it was the single most violent volcanic event in 2 million years. The sky filled with a suffocating blanket of ash and sulfuric acid, casting a deep twilight over the planet for years. Global temperatures plummeted, triggering a volcanic winter that killed off plant life and decimated the animal herds that early humans relied on for survival. Genetic evidence tells a stark story from this period, suggesting the entire global population of Homo sapiens may have crashed to a mere few thousand individuals, clinging to life by a thread. This was the ultimate genetic bottleneck, a brush with total extinction that forced a fundamental change in who we were. In this new, frozen world, the old ways of life no longer work. Scattered bands of survivors were pushed to their absolute limits, and to live, they had to become more than just clever tool users. They had to learn to truly rely on one another. The evolutionary pressure was immense, favoring those who could plan for the distant future, store food, and communicate complex ideas. It likely supercharged the development of our social brains, selecting for the traits we now recognize as quintessentially human: advanced language, deep cooperation, and the ability to form intricate social bonds. The Toba catastrophe was a forge, and the few who endured it were hammered into a new, more resilient and more intelligent form. This newly forged social intelligence would soon become our greatest asset as the world began to warm once more, presenting our ancestors with an entirely new set of challenges. Just as humanity was finding its footing in a warming world, the planet delivered another brutal shock. Around 12,800 years ago, a sudden and mysterious cold snap gripped the Earth, a climatic event known as the Younger Dryas. For 1,000 years, the glaciers began to creep back, and the rich hunting grounds that had sustained our ancestors for generations began to vanish. This was not a gradual change, but a dramatic reversal that threw entire societies back into an ice age. The familiar rhythms of nature were broken, and the old way of life, based on following migrating herds and gathering seasonal plants, became a desperate gamble. In this new, harsh reality, simply finding enough to eat was a constant struggle. It was this struggle that sparked one of the most profound revolutions in human history. In a few key regions, most notably the Fertile Crescent, people were pushed to the brink. They could no longer rely on the abundance of the wild, so they began to experiment to control their environment in ways never before attempted. They started selecting the hardiest seeds from wild grasses like wheat and barley and deliberately planting them in designated areas. They began to corral and manage wild animals like goats and sheep, ensuring a steady supply of meat and milk was close at hand. This was not a planned invention, it was a desperate adaptation, a survival strategy born from climatic catastrophe. The shift from foraging to farming was not an easy one. Early farmers worked harder for longer hours and suffered from more disease and malnutrition than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their diets became less varied, and their lives were tied to the success or failure of a single crop. Yet they gained something priceless: predictability. A stored surplus of grain could see a community through a harsh winter or a dry summer. This reliable food source changed everything. It meant people could stop wandering and build permanent homes. It allowed populations to grow. For the first time, not everyone had to spend every day searching for food. This created the first specialists, people who could become toolmakers, potters, leaders, or priests. The struggle for food security did not just give us farms, it built the very foundation of civilization itself, setting the stage for the next great leap and the next great disaster. But the stability built by farming was a fragile thing. The grand civilizations that rose from the fertile soil were about to face a storm that would shatter their entire world. Around the year 1177 before the Common Era, a cataclysm swept across the eastern Mediterranean. In less than a single lifetime, the great Bronze Age empires, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, even the mighty Egyptians, crumbled into ruin. Their magnificent palaces were burned and abandoned, their trade routes severed, their written languages forgotten. This was not the fall of a single kingdom. It was the collapse of the first globalized age, a perfect storm of chaos that left a profound darkness in its wake. What could possibly have caused such a total systemic failure? Historians point to a cascade of disasters. A prolonged drought and climate shift crippled harvests, leading to famine. Internal rebellions tore at the fabric of society, and then came the Sea Peoples, mysterious marauders from the unknown, attacking coastlines with a ferocity that the old powers could not withstand. The centralized palatial economies, which had hoarded wealth and knowledge, were the first to fall. These palace centers had tightly controlled the production of bronze, the supermaterial of the age. They monopolized the long-distance trade in tin and copper, the essential ingredients, and kept the secrets of metalworking locked within their own workshops. With the palaces gone, that control vanished. The specialized smiths, now without royal patrons, were forced to disperse, taking their invaluable knowledge with them into the countryside and smaller villages. This was a moment of profound democratization. The secret was out. In the power vacuum that followed the collapse, local communities began to experiment. They could no longer rely on the king for bronze weapons or tools, so they turned to a more common, more accessible metal: iron. Iron ore was everywhere, but it was notoriously difficult to work, requiring higher temperatures and new smelting techniques. The diffusion of knowledge from the collapsed centers allowed for this innovation to flourish on a local level. The Age of Bronze, controlled by kings, gave way to the Age of Iron, mastered by common artisans. For the first time, a farmer could possess a metal plowshare as effective as a soldier's sword. The fall of the grand empires broke the monopoly of power, handing technological capability directly to the people. This radical shift did more than just change the tools people used. It began to change the very idea of who should hold power, setting the stage for revolutionary new forms of community that would rise from the ashes. While the collapse of the Bronze Age empires broke the monopoly of metal, it was a single, shattering event that first revealed the true power of the sea. A century before that wider collapse, the very ground beneath the Minoan civilization disappeared in an apocalyptic roar. The volcanic island of Thera exploded with a force thought to be 4 times greater than the famous Krakatoa eruption. The cataclysm was instantaneous and total. The center of the island vanished, collapsing into a vast, seawater-filled caldera. This triggered tsunamis of unimaginable height, waves that radiated outwards at incredible speed, slamming into the northern coast of Crete, the heart of the Minoan world. Their magnificent palaces, like Knossos, were not just damaged, they were scoured clean. Their fleets, the very source of their wealth, were smashed to splinters in their harbors. The Minoan thalassocracy, their maritime trade empire that had dominated the Aegean, was crippled in a single day. The ashfall that blanketed the region poisoned farmlands for a generation, choking off the food supply for any who survived the initial waves. The disaster created an immense power vacuum on the open water, who would now control the trade routes, the flow of copper, tin, and luxury goods that fueled the ancient world. The Mycenaeans, based on the Greek mainland, had long been influenced by the sophisticated Minoans, but they were a more warlike, fortified culture. With the Minoan fleet in ruins, the Mycenaeans saw their opportunity. They poured their resources into shipbuilding, creating vessels that were not just for trade but for war and long-distance exploration. This was not a peaceful expansion. It was a desperate, necessary push to dominate the sea lanes. The terror of the thorough eruption and the subsequent collapse of their primary rival forced the Mycenaeans to become a true naval power. They innovated in hull design and sail technology to travel farther and carry heavier loads. This maritime imperative, born from a volcanic catastrophe, accelerated naval technology and expanded the cultural horizons of the entire Mediterranean, weaving a tighter web of connection that would, ironically, make the later systemic collapse of the Bronze Age even more widespread. The need to master the sea after disaster became a relentless engine of progress, a pattern that would repeat itself on the other side of the world, where a similar collapse would forge an empire from chaos. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried a silent, invisible passenger, death. The unprecedented connectivity of the Silk Road, a marvel of ancient globalization, became a superhighway for deadly pathogens. In the 6th century, a terrifying disease, now known as the Justinianic plague, erupted from the edges of the empire and raced along these routes, carried by fleas on the backs of rats that stowed away in merchant caravans and ships. It reached the bustling capital of Constantinople, where at its peak it was said to kill 10,000 people every single day. The social and economic fabric of entire regions was torn apart by a death toll so vast it is almost impossible to comprehend. In the face of this invisible enemy, old rituals and prayers proved useless. Leaders were forced to think in entirely new ways about how to protect a population. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who himself fell ill but survived, implemented revolutionary new rules. He ordered the swift disposal of the dead and restricted the movement of the sick. While not called quarantine yet, the principle was the same: isolate the infected to protect the healthy and slow the spread of the disease. This was a monumental shift in thinking, moving responsibility from the spiritual to the practical, from the individual to the community. The traumatic experience of these Silk Road pandemics provided a brutal but essential lesson. It established the very foundations of public health, creating a body of hard-won knowledge about contagion and isolation that would be passed down and refined for centuries. Out of the chaos of mass death came the first, fragile systems designed to preserve life on a societal scale. This painful progress shows how societal breakdown can paradoxically create the space for intellectual flourishing, a pattern vividly clear when we look east to the chaos that forged a philosopher. Athens stood as a beacon of democracy and culture, but its golden age was built on fragile ground. The protracted horror of the Peloponnesian War, a decades-long struggle against the militaristic Spartans, was more than a military defeat. It was a slow-motion unraveling of an entire society. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the conflict, chronicled a city tearing itself apart from the inside. A mysterious plague swept through the overcrowded city, killing a third of the population, including its visionary leader Pericles. The social fabric frayed, with political betrayals and savage civil wars breaking out among former allies. Thucydides documented the chilling shift in language, where words changed their meaning, reckless violence became courage, and prudent hesitation was seen as cowardice. This was a collective trauma that exposed the dark depths of human nature when pushed to the brink. How could a society so brilliant and advanced descend into such chaos? This pressing question haunted a generation of thinkers who had witnessed the collapse. For Plato, who saw his mentor Socrates executed by the Athenian democracy, the failure was not just tactical but philosophical. If a democracy could kill its wisest man and lose a war through internal strife, what was the true nature of justice? He retreated from public life to establish his academy, determined to find a more perfect, stable form of government ruled not by the whims of the mob, but by reason and knowledge. His student, Aristotle, took a more empirical approach, systematically studying the constitutions of over 150 different city-states to understand what made them succeed or fail. The catastrophic failure of their own world provided the urgent, practical impetus for this intellectual explosion. They were not asking abstract questions in a vacuum. They were trying to solve the most pressing problem of their time: how to build a state that would not destroy itself. From the ruins of war and plague emerged the first blueprints for the state, theories of justice, and models of governance that would echo for millennia. The very concepts of tyranny, oligarchy, and polity were forged in the fires of this real-world collapse, a brutal but necessary step in humanity's understanding of how to rule itself. The Roman Republic was bleeding out. For a century, its streets ran with the blood of civil wars, from the social wars that pitted Roman against Italian ally, to the proscriptions that saw senators hunting one another for a bounty. Slave revolts led by Spartacus terrified the landed elite, while political assassinations, most famously that of Julius Caesar, became a brutal tool of statecraft. The old system, built on personal alliances and informal understandings between aristocratic families, was never meant to govern an empire stretching from Spain to Syria. It was a city-state government trying to steer a continent, and it was breaking apart at the seams. Out of this protracted chaos, the rise of Augustus was about far more than just replacing a senate with an emperor. His true revolution was administrative. He understood that to prevent the cycle of collapse, he needed to replace personal whim with impersonal procedure. He created the world's first professional, salaried civil service. These were not aristocrats ruling by birthright, but managers, accountants, and engineers hired for their skill. This new bureaucracy standardized everything. For the first time, a law in Gaul meant the same thing as a law in Egypt. Tax collection became predictable and less arbitrary, funding a professional standing army and a vast network of roads, aqueducts, and ports that physically bound the empire together. The Roman Empire's longevity did not come from the genius of its emperors, but from the dull, reliable machinery of its bureaucracy, an invention forged in the fires of civil war to manage chaos on an unimaginable scale. This administrative revolution proved that stability could be engineered, a lesson that would be desperately needed when another empire faced a threat not from within its government, but from beneath its very feet. Flames danced through the narrow, winding alleys of Rome, a city built of wood and crammed with humanity. For 6 relentless days in the year 64, the fire raged, an unstoppable force that consumed 2/3 of the Eternal City and left hundreds of thousands of its citizens homeless amidst the smoldering ruins. The immediate tragedy was immense, a landscape of ash and despair. Yet, from those ashes arose an unprecedented opportunity, a blank canvas on which to reimagine the very idea of a city. Emperor Nero, a figure history remembers for his excesses, seized this moment of total destruction to enact a revolutionary set of building codes. Out went the old, highly flammable wooden tenements. His new laws mandated fire-resistant materials requiring brick and stone for construction. He ordered streets to be widened, creating fire breaks that would prevent future infernos from jumping from block to block with such terrifying speed. For the first time, city planning incorporated large, open public spaces, squares that provided both refuge in an emergency and areas for community life. This was not merely reconstruction, it was the birth of urban resilience. The disaster forced a systematic rethinking of how people should live together in dense populations, establishing foundational principles of public safety, hygiene, and infrastructure management. The chaotic, organic growth of the ancient city was replaced by a pragmatic vision of order, a blueprint for safer living that would influence urban design for centuries to come. This deliberate redesign of a metropolis born from fire demonstrated a new capacity to learn from catastrophe and build back smarter, a philosophy that would be put to the ultimate test when the very earth itself began to shake. The invisible enemy that felled emperors and legions alike demanded a new kind of defense. At the very height of its power, the Roman Empire was struck by a pestilence so devastating it reshaped the ancient world. The Antonine plague, likely a brutal form of smallpox, entered Rome with troops returning from campaign in the Near East around the year 165. It swept through the densely populated empire with a terrifying speed, killing millions, decimating the army, and even claiming the co-emperor Lucius Verus. The sheer scale of death created a crisis that the old, informal traditions of healing could not possibly manage. This was a biological catastrophe that forced medicine to evolve from a private art into a public necessity. In the midst of the chaos, a Greek physician named Galen began meticulously documenting the symptoms and progression of the disease. His detailed observations, born from the frantic work of treating countless victims, became a foundational text for future generations. The plague created an urgent demand for organized, replicable medical knowledge, spurring the systematic compilation and dissemination of these Greek texts throughout the Roman world. But it was not just about books. The Roman genius for logistics and organization was now applied to the human body. To care for its vast military, the empire had already begun establishing valetudinaria, military hospitals that could treat wounded soldiers. The plague supercharged this development, leading to a greater proliferation of these institutions, and even their expansion to treat the crucial labor force of slaves on large estates. For the first time, the concept of a dedicated space for medical treatment, staffed by trained professionals, became a standardized feature of the state. This was the true leap forward, the birth of institutional medicine. The desperate, collective fight against a pandemic pushed Roman science to create systems of care that would outlive the empire itself, a legacy of order forged in the crucible of disease. This pattern of crisis driving scientific structure would find a powerful echo not in the world of medicine, but in the very heavens themselves when the sky itself seemed to turn against humanity. The Roman Empire was cracking under its own weight. In the turbulent 3rd century, the sprawling realm faced a perfect storm of calamity, with barbarian invasions piercing its frontiers, rival generals erupting into civil war, and a currency so debased it triggered hyperinflation. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year nightmare where the very idea of a unified Rome nearly vanished forever. The grand strategy of open frontiers and fluid borders, once a symbol of confident power, was now a fatal vulnerability. How do you protect an empire when the threat comes from every direction at once? The answer, forged in the fires of near-total collapse, was written in stone and mortar. Emperors like Aurelian and later Diocletian initiated the most ambitious military engineering project the world had yet seen. They did not just patch the old defenses, they reimagined them entirely. The Aurelian walls, a massive circuit around the city of Rome itself, were a stark admission that the eternal city was no longer safe in its own heartland. More importantly, the vast network of frontier fortifications, the limes, were transformed from scattered outposts into an integrated, heavily garrisoned barrier. This was not a single wall like Hadrian's, but a deep system of forts, watchtowers, and fortified towns designed to slow, channel, and break any invading force. This frantic, empire-wide construction boom was a direct response to existential fear. It standardized military architecture and created a defensive mindset that would define European warfare for 1,000 years. The landscape of the continent was permanently altered, dotted with the stone skeletons of these survivalist structures. The desperate need to wall out chaos did not just fortify borders, it fundamentally reshaped how societies thought about security, turning inward and hardening their shells. This same primal drive for survival, the need to control one's environment against a relentless threat, would soon be directed not at human enemies, but at the unyielding power of water itself. Far to the east of Rome's stone walls, another civilization was confronting a threat not of armies, but of a disappearing landscape. The Indus Valley civilization was a marvel of the ancient world. Its great cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa laid out with a geometric precision that would not be seen again for thousands of years. They had complex drainage systems, standardized weights, and buildings made of uniformly sized bricks. Then, around 1,900 years before the Common Era, this meticulously ordered world began to unravel. The great rivers that were the lifeblood of the civilization, the Indus and the Gagga-Hakra, started to shift their courses. Some channels dried up completely, while others flooded with unpredictable fury. A prolonged period of aridity set in, turning fertile farmlands into dust. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding decline as the very environment that had nurtured this urban experiment turned against it. The people did not simply vanish, they dispersed. The grand, centralized urban planning was no longer possible, so communities fragmented into smaller villages and relocated to where the water was still reliable. In this new, decentralized existence, the old knowledge of the city builders did not die. It was adapted and refined on a local scale. The struggle for every drop of water became a daily necessity, forcing these successor communities to become masters of hydraulic engineering. They constructed intricate, brick-lined wells that tapped deep into the receding water table. They built large, centralized water storage tanks to capture the precious monsoon rains. They dug networks of small, efficient irrigation canals to direct water from the remaining river channels directly to their fields. This was innovation born of pure survival, a desperate and brilliant response to a changing climate. The knowledge of how to tame and manage water, first developed in the great cities, was now being perfected in countless small villages. This localized revolution in water management created a lasting legacy. The techniques of well digging, tank construction, and canal irrigation developed in this period became the bedrock of agriculture across the Indian subcontinent for the next 4 millennia. The civilization's grand urban dream faded, but its most practical wisdom, hardened and advanced by catastrophe, ensured its descendants would endure. This intimate dance with a volatile climate, where survival hinged on mastering a single, vital resource, would be a challenge faced by another society on the opposite side of the globe, where the very rain clouds held the power of life and death. Deep in the lush Mesoamerican rainforest, the great Maya civilization reached its zenith. Towering limestone pyramids pierced the jungle canopy, and powerful city-states like Tikal and Calakmul thrived in a world of intricate art, complex writing, and profound astronomical knowledge. Then, with shocking speed, it all fell apart. By the 9th century, the grand plazas fell silent, the temples were swallowed by vines, and the urban centers were abandoned to the jungle. This was not a single event, but a cascade of crises. A series of severe, multi-generational droughts parched the land, crippling the agricultural foundation that supported a population that had grown too large. Warfare between rival kingdoms intensified, draining resources and shattering political stability. The societal contract between the people and their divine kings, who were believed to ensure the rains would fall, was broken. In their desperation, the Maya priestly class turned their eyes to the heavens with renewed urgency. Their very survival depended on understanding why the gods had turned away. They meticulously tracked the movements of Venus, the cycles of the moon, and the precise timing of solar eclipses, searching for patterns, for a way to predict the return of the life-giving rains. This was not an academic exercise, it was a frantic survival strategy. The relentless pressure to comprehend the disaster pushed their celestial science to its absolute peak. They refined their long-count calendar, achieving a level of accuracy in modeling planetary movements that would not be rivaled for centuries. Their observations, meticulously recorded in bark paper books like the Dresden Codex, contain incredibly precise calculations for lunar cycles and even predictions of celestial events. The collapse of their cities forced a final, brilliant flowering of their astronomy, a science born from the desperate need to find order in a world descending into chaos. This drive to master the skies in the face of earthly ruin is a powerful echo of a pattern we see across the globe, where the threat of total loss pushes human ingenuity to its absolute limit. The slow dissolution of the Western Roman Empire was not a single dramatic fall, but a gradual fading, a tapestry unraveling thread by thread. Throughout the 5th century, various Germanic peoples, the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, moved across its frontiers, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as settlers, and often as both. They did not merely sack Rome, they moved into its homes and farmed its lands, creating a new, blended reality from the fragments of the old order. The grand imperial bureaucracy that once managed a continent fell silent, its tax rolls and legal decrees replaced by the localized personal rule of tribal kings. For centuries, this era has been labeled a dark age, a time of violence and ignorance. But within that seeming chaos, a quiet, deliberate rescue mission was underway. As the secular institutions of Rome crumbled, the flickering torch of knowledge was not extinguished. It was carried into the cloistered silence of monastic scriptoria. Isolated in remote communities like Monte Cassino or the islands of Iona and Lindisfarne, monks became the unsung librarians of a dying world. Their primary mission was sacred, to copy the scriptures and the writings of the Church Fathers. Yet, in their meticulous work, they preserved something more: a classical text by Virgil or Plato, a scientific treatise by Galen, a philosophical work by Cicero. These pagan authors were often seen as possessing a glimmer of divine truth. So the monks copied them too, transforming fragile papyrus scrolls into durable parchment codices. For generation after generation, they bent over their writing desks, their hands tracing the letters that held the entire intellectual inheritance of the classical world. This was not a grand, state-sponsored project. It was a decentralized, almost invisible network of preservation, a desperate act of faith that became one of history's greatest intellectual safekeeping operations. The political fragmentation of Europe, which seemed to spell the end of civilization, paradoxically forced the concentrated preservation of its memory. scattering the seeds of a future rebirth deep within the protective soil of the monastery walls. The invisible killer that had traveled the Silk Road returned with a vengeance, striking at the very heart of the Roman world just as it sought to reclaim its former glory. The Justinianic plague erupted in the year 541, a pestilence so thorough it seemed to leave no household untouched. In the bustling capital of Constantinople, the streets grew quiet, then filled with the dead, with chroniclers reporting that at its peak, the disease claimed 10,000 lives every single day. The empire, under the ambitious Emperor Justinian, had been in the midst of a grand reconquest of the lost western provinces. This biological catastrophe brought those dreams to a sudden, grinding halt. Armies melted away, tax revenues evaporated, and the entire economic engine of the state seized up. In the immediate term, the empire was critically weakened, its reach shrinking as it struggled simply to bury its dead. Yet from this nadir of human suffering emerged a profound and unexpected social transformation. With such a staggering portion of the population gone, a simple, brutal truth of economics took hold. The surviving workers became vastly more valuable. The peasants who farmed the land and the artisans who crafted essential goods found themselves in a position of power for the first time. There were simply not enough hands to do all the work. This catastrophic labor shortage forced landowners and the state to offer higher wages and better conditions to attract workers. The rigid structures of the late Roman world, which had bound people to their land and their trades, began to loosen. A subtle but significant shift of economic power began to flow downward, improving the lot of the common person not through revolution, but through devastating attrition. Simultaneously, as every other institution seemed to falter, people turned to the two pillars that promised order and salvation, the emperor and the Orthodox Church. Justinian, projecting an image of divinely sanctioned authority, poured resources into massive public works and grand churches, most famously the Hagia Sophia, as a physical testament to God's favor and imperial permanence. The Church, in turn, organized relief for the sick and gave meaning to the seemingly random cruelty of the disease, weaving itself into the daily life and identity of the people. The shared trauma of the plague did not destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. Instead, it forged a new, more resilient identity. The crisis cemented the fusion of imperial power and Orthodox faith, creating the bedrock of the Byzantine Empire, a civilization that would endure for another 900 years. The very institutions that provided stability in the chaos became the defining features of the state that emerged from it. From the cloistered scriptoria of Europe to the steppes of Central Asia, a new storm was gathering, one that would shatter old isolations with terrifying force. The thunder of Mongol hooves became the sound of an entire continent being forcibly rewired. The conquests of the 13th century were a whirlwind of destruction, leaving shattered cities and staggering death tolls from the walls of Beijing to the plains of Hungary. Yet, from this crucible of violence emerged a paradox. The creation of the largest contiguous land empire in history also forged the first truly global network. The Mongols, practical above all else, understood that a conquered territory was worthless if its trade routes were unsafe. They enforced what would be known as the Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. For the first time, a merchant could travel the entire length of the Silk Road under a single, ruthless legal system. Banditry was met with swift and brutal punishment, and the old patchwork of warring kingdoms that had made the journey so perilous was swept away. This unprecedented security opened the arteries of exchange wider than ever before. It was not just silk and spices that now flowed freely, but the very bedrock of future technologies. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, the compass, and advanced paper-making techniques moved westward, carried by traders and scholars who could now journey for thousands of miles without needing a new passport or fearing a new war at every border. In the other direction, Islamic astronomy and mathematics traveled east, while European glassmaking and financial instruments found new markets. This was the world that a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo stepped into. His famous travels, which seemed so fantastical to Europeans, were only possible because of the secure, integrated world the Mongols had brutally assembled. His written account of the wealth and sophistication of the East did not just inspire wonder, it created an insatiable appetite, a geographic hunger that would eventually drive explorers to seek new sea routes when the land bridges later closed. The Mongol invasions, for all their horror, forcibly snapped together the pieces of a disconnected world, proving that even the most destructive force could inadvertently lay the groundwork for a new age of connection. This brutal connectivity, however, would soon carry a price, as the very pathways they secured became a highway for an invisible foe far more devastating than any army. The very pathways that the Mongols had secured now carried a final, invisible passenger to Europe's shores. The Black Death arrived in 1347, a pestilence of such horrifying speed and scale that it seemed like the end of the world. Within just a few years, it wiped out as much as half of the entire continent's population. The social and psychological trauma was immeasurable, with whole villages left empty and the stench of death hanging over cities. The old certainties of faith and feudal obligation crumbled in the face of such random, merciless destruction. Yet, from this abyss of despair, the rigid structures of medieval society were shattered for good. The manorial system, which had bound peasants as serfs to the land for generations, collapsed almost overnight. There were simply too few people left to work the fields and shops. For the first time, the common laborer held a powerful card: scarcity. Lords, desperate to harvest their crops and keep their estates running, were forced to compete for workers. They offered higher wages, better living conditions, and even the chance for peasants to buy their freedom. This was a revolutionary transfer of wealth and economic power, flowing from the nobility down to the everyday craftsman and farmer. A new, more affluent middle class began to emerge, people with money in their pockets and aspirations beyond mere survival. This newly empowered bourgeoisie did not want to build castles or fund crusades. They wanted to beautify their own lives and their communities. They became patrons of artists, commissioning portraits and frescoes for their homes and local churches. They invested in education, funding new universities and libraries. They financed voyages of exploration, seeking new trade routes and opportunities. The immense capital that had been locked away in the hands of a few feudal lords was now circulating, creating the financial fuel for an explosion of creativity and inquiry. The despair of the plague created the economic conditions for a golden age. The collective trauma forced a profound shift in perspective, turning attention from the afterlife to the potential of this life, from divine judgment to human achievement. The Black Death did not just kill millions, it killed an old world, making way for the brilliant, turbulent dawn of the Renaissance. The ash cloud from Thera cast a long shadow, one that stretched all the way to the sun-drenched banks of the Nile. In Egypt, a civilization built on the predictable rhythm of the sun and the river, the sky began to behave strangely. Contemporary texts speak of days of unnatural darkness, a sun that struggled to break through a hazy sky, and a world plunged into a deep, unshakable gloom. For the Egyptians, this was not merely bad weather, it was a crack in the foundation of the universe itself. Their entire society was built on the principle of Maat, the cosmic order of truth, balance, and harmony that the pharaoh was divinely obligated to uphold. He was the intermediary between the gods and the people, the one who ensured the sun would rise and the Nile would flood. When the sky remained dark and the climate grew strange, it was a direct and very public failure. The pharaoh's divine mandate was being questioned by the heavens themselves. This environmental crisis, born from a volcano hundreds of miles away, planted a seed of profound doubt. Could the old gods and their traditional rituals truly maintain order in the face of such chaos? This simmering theological crisis may have found its ultimate expression just a few generations later during the startling Amarna period. The pharaoh Akhenaten, in a radical break with 1,000 years of tradition, rejected the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods. He declared that there was only one supreme deity, the Aten, or the sun disk itself. He abandoned the old religious capital of Thebes and built an entirely new city dedicated to this single god. The art of this period changed dramatically, shifting from idealized, formal representations to startlingly intimate and naturalistic scenes of the royal family bathed in the rays of the Aten. This was not a gradual evolution, it was a revolution from the top, a desperate attempt to reset the relationship between the divine and the earthly after the old ways had been proven vulnerable. A volcanic eruption in the distant Aegean did not cause Akhenaten's heresy directly, but it created the cultural rupture, the moment of instability that made such a radical reimagining of the world possible. When a society's fundamental contract with the cosmos is broken by an outside shock, the door is flung open for someone to try and write a new one. They moved across the sea like a force of nature, their origins a mystery that still haunts history. The Sea Peoples, a shadowy confederation of warriors, descended upon the eastern Mediterranean coastline in wave after terrifying wave. They were not a single nation, but a storm of different groups, striking with a new kind of warfare that the grand empires were utterly unprepared to face. The old powers, like the Hittites and the Egyptians, relied on a rigid military system built around the chariot, a powerful but expensive and inflexible weapon that required flat, open plains to be effective. The Sea Peoples fought on foot and from ships, their tactics fluid and unpredictable. They may have wielded the earliest iron swords, weapons that could shatter the bronze blades of the royal armies. This was not a battle of armies, but a clash of eras, and the old world was losing. The sheer pressure of their onslaught, combined with famine and internal rebellion, shattered the interconnected Bronze Age world. The great palace centers, with their monopolies on bronze and their chariot legions, were burned and abandoned, their complex trade networks severed. In the smoldering ruins they left behind, a desperate innovation took root. The survivors and the new peoples rising in the region, like the Philistines along the coast and the Israelite tribes in the highlands, faced a stark new reality. They could no longer rely on a distant king to supply them with bronze weapons. The secret of metalworking, once guarded in royal workshops, was now a skill for survival. These emerging communities turned to the one metal that was readily available almost everywhere: iron. But iron was a stubborn, difficult material. Smelting it required higher temperatures and new furnace designs, and working it into a useful tool or weapon was a blacksmith's art. The constant threat of invasion, the need to arm every able-bodied person with a weapon that would not shatter, created a powerful incentive to master this technology. It sparked a relentless arms race on a local level. Villages and chieftains competed to have the best smiths, the sharpest swords, the most durable plowshares. This was the true revolution. Iron was democratizing power. A bronze sword was a symbol of aristocracy, but an iron hoe was a tool for a common farmer that could till harder soil and produce more food. An iron plowshare could open up new lands for cultivation, lands that were previously too tough for weaker bronze or wooden tools. The very material that made better weapons for defense also created more robust tools for everyday life, fueling an economic surge from the ground up. The terrifying shadow of the Sea Peoples did not just destroy a world, it forced the creation of a new, more resilient one, where technological power began to flow into the hands of the many, not just the few. A storm of horsemen erupted from the Central Asian steppes, a whirlwind of terror that shattered the quiet of the 4th century. The Huns, masters of mounted warfare and psychological terror, swept into Eastern Europe with a ferocity that seemed supernatural to the settled peoples in their path. Their sudden, violent arrival was like a boulder dropped into a pond, sending shockwaves of displacement rippling outward. Entire tribes found themselves caught between the anvil of the Hunnic advance and the hammer of the Roman frontier. The Goths, a powerful Germanic people, were the first to feel the pressure, pleading with Rome for sanctuary across the Danube River. When that sanctuary turned into exploitation and famine, their desperation ignited into open rebellion, culminating in the stunning Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378. This was the spark that lit the fuse of the Great Migration. Wave after wave of peoples, the Vandals, the Suebi, the Alans, were now set in motion, not as invaders in a traditional sense, but as desperate masses crashing against the gates of the empire, seeking land and survival. The Western Roman Empire, already strained by internal decay, simply could not withstand this relentless, multi-front demographic pressure. Its political structures fractured, and its legions could no longer hold the line. But from this seemingly endless chaos of war and displacement, something new was being forged in the fire. The old tribal identities, once so distinct, began to blur and merge on the long road of exile. A Vandal might marry a Roman, a Goth might adopt the speech of a Gallic peasant. The constant movement broke down ancient boundaries, forcing a profound cultural and genetic fusion across the entire continent. This was the painful, messy process of ethnogenesis, the birth of new peoples from the fragments of the old. The very names that once meant barbarian hordes, like the Franks in Gaul or the Lombards in Italy, slowly became the labels for the kingdoms that would one day evolve into France and Germany. The Hunnic invasions, for all their destructive horror, did not simply destroy an empire. They acted as a violent, continental-scale mixer, churning the human ingredients of Europe until old separations were gone. The demographic foundations of the modern continent were laid in this era of terrifying flux, a powerful reminder that the reshaping of the human map, however traumatic, can clear the ground for entirely new worlds to be built. This same principle of destruction clearing the way for creation would be witnessed on a different scale when a disaster of the natural world reshaped the very air we breathe. A final wave of water, this one rising not from a volcano but from the very edge of a continental shelf, would carve a nation's destiny. Off the coast of Norway, around 6,200 years before the Common Era, a vast undersea slope collapsed. An area of seabed larger than many modern countries slid into the abyss in what is known as the Storegga Slide. The displacement of such an immense volume of water triggered a tsunami, a wall of ocean that raced across the North Sea. Its target was a low-lying, fertile plain known as Doggerland, a land bridge that connected the British peninsula to mainland Europe. For the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived there, it was not a bridge but a world, a thriving landscape of hills, forests, and rivers teeming with game. The wave did not just flood this land, it scoured it, swallowing entire ecosystems and drowning the homes of countless people in a single, catastrophic day. The sea never retreated. The connection was permanently severed, and where there had been land, there was now only the cold, grey water of the English Channel and the North Sea. The survivors on the high grounds of the newly formed British Isles found themselves utterly alone. their world had shrunk from a continent to an island in a geological instant. This forced isolation became a powerful engine of change. Cut off from the constant flow of people and ideas from the continent, these communities began to develop in their own unique direction. Their tools, their art, and their social structures started to diverge, creating a distinct cultural identity forged in isolation. Then, centuries later, a new wave of people arrived, not by land but by boat. These were Neolithic farmers migrating from Europe with their domesticated animals and seed grains. They did not find an empty land to settle, but an established, if isolated, population of hunter-gatherers. The meeting of these two peoples, the indigenous islanders and the continental farmers, was a direct consequence of that ancient tsunami. The disaster had created both the stage and the separate actors for this pivotal moment in prehistory. Their interaction, a complex mix of conflict, exchange, and intermarriage, laid the very first foundations for the unique genetic and cultural tapestry of the British Isles. A single, violent geological event did not just change a map, it dictated the course of human history for thousands of years, proving that our identities are sometimes written not in stone, but in the relentless motion of earth and water. From the genetic bottleneck of Toba to the tsunamis that reshaped coastlines, a single, undeniable pattern has emerged from the ashes. Our history is not a gentle climb, but a story of brutal collapses that cleared the ground for brilliant rebirth. Time and again, humanity's greatest leaps in technology, society, and thought were not born in times of peace, but forged in the fires of total disaster. These catastrophes did not just destroy, they acted as a brutal but effective reset. They shattered stagnant systems that had resisted change for centuries, broke the monopolies of powerful elites, and created the intense, survival-level pressure necessary for genuine innovation. When the old world fell apart, people were forced to cooperate in new ways, to invent out of pure necessity, and to see their environment and each other through an entirely new lens. The story of our progress is a turbulent journey of advance and retreat, where every collapse contains the hidden seeds of a future renaissance. So as you look at the profound challenges shaping our own world today, consider this provocative thought. Could the crises we now face, from climate shifts to global pandemics, be the very catalysts for our next great leap forward? The past suggests that our most desperate moments have often been the prelude to our greatest transformations. If this perspective on history's hidden turning points has reshaped how you see our journey, subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries of our past. We would love to hear which of these ancient disasters you found most transformative, so share your thoughts in the comments below. This relentless rhythm of collapse and creation is not a random sequence of tragedies. It is the central pulse of human history, a process of creative destruction etched into our very bones. Each of these disasters, from volcanic super eruptions to continent-spanning plagues, did more than just erase an old world. They actively manufactured the vacuum, the pressure, and the desperation required for a new one to be born. Think of a forest fire. It is a terrifying force of annihilation, yet the ash it leaves behind enriches the soil, creating the perfect conditions for new, stronger seeds to sprout. Our history works in the same way. Resilience, in this grand view, is not about simply rebuilding what was lost. It is about bouncing forward, using the explosive energy of a breakdown to propel ourselves into a new state of organization, a higher level of understanding, and a more adaptable way of life. This is the profound thematic legacy left to us by 20 ancient calamities. It gives us a crucial lens through which to view the daunting challenges of our own era. When we face the specter of climate change or the disruption of a global pandemic, or the upheaval of our economic systems, it is easy to see only the threat of collapse. But history whispers a different, more empowering story. These are potential inflection points, moments when the old rules are suspended and everything becomes possible. Our ancestors did not merely survive their darkest hours, they used them. They transformed catastrophe into the raw material for opportunity. This is not a call for naive optimism, but for a deeper, more historical form of hope, one rooted in agency. The end of one world, as terrifying as it may seem, has always been the brutal but necessary beginning of the